Welcome back to the last report, where official records end and the real nightmare begins. Tonight, we open sealed case files from the Louisiana Bayou, missing patrol cars, temporal distortions, and an ancient presence that federal authorities have tried to contain for 70 years. What began as routine traffic enforcement on Interstate 10 became something that shattered the line between past and present, forcing one trooper to confront not just the impossible, but a truth that the government has buried beneath layers of classified documentation. So lower the lights, lock your doors, and listen carefully. This is the Atchafalaya Basin case. My name is Trooper Marcus Thibodeaux, badge number 2847, Louisiana State Police, and I have patrolled the highways of Louisiana for 17 years. Before I tell you what happened on February 15th, 2022, before I explain why I finally broke my silence after signing 3 separate non-disclosure agreements with the Department of Homeland Security, I want you to understand something very clearly. If you're watching this while planning to drive through Louisiana, if you're thinking about taking Interstate 10 through the Atchafalaya Basin between mile marker 115 and mile marker 121, you need to understand what you're really driving through. Drop a comment. Are you from Louisiana? Have you ever driven that stretch at night and noticed your GPS showing impossible locations? Your radio picking up voices speaking French from decades past? Or your speedometer reading numbers that don't match your sense of time passing? What I'm about to tell you could save your life, or at least prepare you for what you might encounter in those 6 miles of swampland where the living world and something else bleed into each other. There is a section of Interstate 10 that cuts through the Atchafalaya Basin, the largest wetland and swamp in the United States, covering approximately 860,000 acres of cypress swamps and bottomland hardwoods. The highway runs on an elevated structure, the Atchafalaya Basin Bridge, which at 18.2 miles is one of the longest bridges in the United States. But between mile markers 115 and 121, something happens that is not on any map, not in any official documentation, and not discussed in any Louisiana State Police briefing. I know because I've seen the classified files. I know because I've become part of what happens there. Everyone has the right to know what is really going on in the area approximately 6 miles long where Interstate 10 crosses over what the Chitimacha people call Atchafalaya, which translates roughly to where time forgets itself. What I am about to tell you goes against every oath I swore to uphold, every protocol I was trained to follow, and every instinct I have to protect the institutional authority of law enforcement. After what happened last month, after learning that we lost 3 more people to the phenomenon, after watching another young trooper get pulled into the zone with no preparation and no warning, I can no longer remain silent. This is the story that the Louisiana State Police, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency would prefer stayed buried in classified archives marked with security clearances higher than most elected officials possess. I joined the Louisiana State Police in 2005, fresh out of the academy, full of ideals about serving and protecting. I spent my first years working accidents on I-10, dealing with the inevitable carnage that comes from people driving 80 miles per hour through fog, rain, and the general chaos of Louisiana traffic. I've pulled bodies from twisted metal. I've held dying motorists as they took their last breaths. I've notified families that their loved ones aren't coming home. I thought I understood death. I thought I understood the worst that could happen on a highway. I was wrong about everything. Before February 15th, 2022, I was a rational man. I believed in evidence, in procedures, in the solidity of the world. I respected the old Cajun stories my grandmother told about the loup-garou and the roux-garou, about feu follet dancing in the swamps, about spirits that never rest in the bayou, but I thought they were just stories, folklore passed down to frighten children and entertain tourists. I had no idea that every single story was a warning wrapped in metaphor, a desperate attempt by people who knew the truth to prepare future generations for what lived in the deep water. February 15th, 2022 started like any other night shift. I clocked in at Troop 1 headquarters in Lafayette at 1800 hours, checked out Patrol Unit 2847, a standard-issue Dodge Charger with 47,000 miles on it, fully equipped with dashcam, radio, radar, and all the technology that modern law enforcement depends on. My assignment was routine: patrol I-10 from Lafayette to Baton Rouge, focus on traffic enforcement, assist with any accidents or breakdowns, maintain visibility. The weather was clear, temperature around 68 degrees, humidity at 73%, typical for February in Louisiana. Everything was by the book. Everything was normal. I had no way of knowing that by 03:33 hours, I would be standing in a place that shouldn't exist, talking to people who died in 1952, and making a choice that would permanently alter the fabric of my existence. The first call came in at 22:47 hours. Dispatch reported a stalled vehicle on I-10 eastbound, mile marker 117, right in the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin bridge. The caller was a female, distressed, said her car just died. All electronics failed. She was alone and scared. Standard breakdown call, happens a dozen times a night on that stretch. I acknowledged the call, activated my lights, and headed east from my position near mile marker 95. The drive should have taken about 15 minutes. I remember checking my watch as I passed mile marker 110. It was 23,001 hours. I remember thinking about my daughter's basketball game the next day, about needing to pick up milk on the way home, about completely mundane things that belonged to a world I was about to leave behind. As I approached mile marker 115, my radio started picking up static. Not unusual in the basin, the humidity and the cypress swamps can interfere with signals, but this was different. Underneath the static, I could hear voices speaking French. Not modern French, but old Acadian French, the dialect my great-grandmother spoke. Words and phrases I recognized from childhood but couldn't quite translate. I adjusted the frequency, thinking I was picking up some Canadian station bleeding through the airwaves, but every frequency had the same voices, the same static, the same sense of wrongness. My GPS started showing my location as coordinates that placed me 3.7 miles north of the highway, in the middle of the swamp itself, which was impossible since I could see the concrete barrier on either side of the elevated roadway. The speedometer showed 65 miles per hour, but I felt like I was moving through something thick, like the air itself had weight and resistance. Then I saw the car. A 2018 Honda Civic Silver, hazard lights flashing, pulled onto the narrow shoulder. But as I got closer, my headlights caught something that made my training and experience suddenly worthless. The car was there, solid and real, but I could see through it. Not transparent exactly, but like it existed in multiple states simultaneously. I could see the woman inside, blonde hair, early 30s, terrified expression, and I could also see the empty roadway where the car should have been. And I could see something else, something that looked like the same stretch of road but covered in water, cypress trees growing through the pavement, Spanish moss hanging from overhead structures that flickered between modern highway signs, and wooden posts with hand-painted warnings in French. I pulled up behind the vehicle, my training taking over despite the impossibility of what I was seeing. I activated my spotlight, ran the plates through the system, but the computer returned an error I'd never seen before. Temporal registry conflict. Contact supervisor. I tried the radio. Dispatch, this is 2847. I'm 1097 at mile marker 117. Requesting backup and clarification on vehicle registration. I'm getting an unusual error code. The response was pure static, but underneath it, a voice, clear as anything, speaking in that old Acadian French. N'allez pas là-bas. C'est l'heure où les morts marchent. Don't go there. It's the hour when the dead walk. My grandmother's voice, or someone who sounded exactly like her, coming through the radio of a modern patrol car on a highway that didn't exist when she was alive. I stepped out of my unit, and the moment my boots hit the pavement, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The temperature had dropped, my breath visible in the air despite my dashboard thermometer reading 68 degrees. The humidity felt wrong, too thick, pressing against my skin like it had physical weight. The sound of the swamp had changed. No insects, no frogs, no ambient noise of the living bayou. Just silence, absolute and complete, broken only by a sound like distant drums or heartbeats, rhythmic and steady, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I approached the Honda, my hand instinctively on my service weapon. Though what good a Glock would do against whatever this was, I had no idea. The woman looked up at me as I approached, and I saw her mouth moving, saw her screaming, but I heard nothing, not a sound. Her hands were pressed against the window, and I could see that her fingers were leaving frost patterns on the glass, intricate geometric shapes that looked almost like writing, like some language I should have been able to read, but couldn't. I tried the door handle. Locked. I tapped on the window, tried to signal her to unlock it, but she just kept screaming silently, her eyes wide with terror, looking not at me, but through me, at something behind me. I turned around. The highway was gone, not missing, transformed. I was standing on a wooden bridge, cypress planks beneath my boots, torches burning in iron sconces along wooden railings, the smell of burning pitch and decay filling the air. My patrol car was still there, but it looked wrong, like it was made of shadows and light rather than metal and plastic, flickering between existence and non-existence. The Honda was gone completely, and standing about 50 feet down the bridge were people, dozens of them, all wearing clothes from different eras. I saw men in 1950s suits and fedoras, standing next to women in 1920s flapper dresses, standing next to Confederate soldiers, standing next to Native Americans in traditional clothing, standing next to people in modern jeans and t-shirts. All of them were watching me. All of them had the same expression, a mixture of pity and recognition, and something that looked like welcome. I did what any trained law enforcement officer would do when confronted with something impossible. I pulled my weapon, took a defensive stance, and shouted, "Louisiana State Police, identify yourselves." My voice sounded wrong in the thick air, muffled and distant, like I was shouting underwater. None of them moved. They just stood there, watching, waiting. Then one of them stepped forward, a man in a Louisiana State Police uniform, but not modern issue. The style was from the 1950s, the badge number 1952, the nameplate reading Thibodeaux, my last name. My great-uncle, who, according to family history, disappeared in 1952 while on patrol, vanished without a trace, no body found, case closed as missing, presumed dead. But here he was, standing on this impossible bridge, looking exactly as he did in the single photograph my grandmother kept on her mantle. He spoke, and his voice came from everywhere, resonating in my chest, in my bones, in my teeth. Marcus, you're right on time. We've been waiting for you. I wanted to say this was impossible, wanted to cite 100 rational explanations, but the truth is, I knew. Somewhere deep in my DNA, in the genetic memory passed down through generations of Thibodeaux who lived in these swamps, I knew this moment had been coming. I knew that every story my grandmother told was true. I knew that the reason my uncle disappeared was because he had reached this exact spot at this exact time and made a choice. Now it was my turn. "This isn't real," I said, my training and rationality making one last desperate stand against the evidence of my senses. "This is a hallucination, carbon monoxide poisoning, something." My uncle smiled, sad and understanding. "Is reality only what you can understand, Marcus? Is the world only what they teach you in the academy? You know better. You've always known better. You're a Thibodeaux. We remember." He gestured to the assembled crowd of people from across time. "Everyone here made the same choice you're about to make. Everyone here was called to this place, this threshold between what was, what is, and what could be. The Atchafalaya remembers everything, Marcus. Every person who died in these waters, every crime committed on these roads, every moment of joy and terror and loss that has occurred in this basin for 10,000 years. It all exists here, simultaneously, eternally." The Chitimacha knew this. They marked this place as sacred, as forbidden, as the point where the temporal world and the eternal world overlap. They had treaties, agreements, protocols for maintaining the boundary. Then the highway came. Then the bridge was built. Then modern people in their arrogance decided to run an interstate highway directly through a dimensional threshold, and they wondered why people kept disappearing. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but before I could speak, the scene shifted again. I was standing in an office. Or rather, I was experiencing the memory of standing in an office. I knew, without knowing how I knew, that this was a Department of Interior facility in New Orleans, and the date was October 3rd, 1952. I was seeing through my uncle's eyes, experiencing his memory. A man in a dark suit, no identification, no badge, just authority radiating from every gesture, was placing documents in front of him. "Trooper Thibodeaux, you've been selected for a classified assignment, Operation Threshold. What I'm about to tell you is protected under the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. Unauthorized disclosure carries penalties, including life imprisonment. Do you understand?" My uncle, or I, or whoever I was in this memory, nodded. The man continued. "In 1944, during routine mapping surveys for potential highway construction through the Atchafalaya Basin, survey crews discovered anomalies, time distortions, people entering areas and emerging hours later believing only minutes had passed, equipment failures, hallucinations. At first, we thought it was swamp gas, methane, natural explanations. Then people started disappearing. Not lost, disappeared, vanished from locked vehicles with no signs of struggle. We found their cars days later, perfectly intact, but the occupants were gone. Some came back, changed, talking about things they couldn't possibly know, speaking languages they'd never learned, having memories of events that happened decades or centuries ago. The man pulled out photographs, laying them on the desk. I saw images of people standing in various states of translucence, like they were caught between existence and non-existence. I saw photographs of the same stretch of highway taken minutes apart, showing completely different structures, different eras, different realities. I saw documentation of 147 disappeared persons between 1944 and 1952, all along what would eventually become Interstate 10 through the Atchafalaya Basin.
"We can't stop the highway construction," the man said. "Economic development, post-war expansion, political realities. But we can monitor it. We need someone local, someone with roots in this land, someone the phenomenon might accept. You've been selected as the guardian. Your job is to monitor the zone, document incidents, and when necessary, guide people through. Some will resist, some will go mad, some will transcend. Your job is to make sure the threshold remains stable." The memory faded, and I was back on the wooden bridge, my uncle standing in front of me, that sad smile still on his face. "I served for 47 years, Marcus. To the outside world, I disappeared in 1952. But I've been here, in the zone, existing across all timelines simultaneously, guiding others, maintaining the boundary. Now my time is ending. The phenomenon requires renewal. A Thibodeaux must always stand at the threshold. It's been our family's burden since before the first French settlers arrived, when we were still Chitimacha, when we understood that this place was sacred. You're next." I looked at the assembled crowd, seeing now that some of them wore the same expression my uncle had, that mixture of duty and resignation and something that might have been peace. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My uncle gestured to the darkening swamp around us. The threshold collapses. The boundary between times dissolves. Everything that has been contained here, every moment of violence and death and transformation, spreads outward. How far? We don't know. Maybe just the basin. Maybe all of Louisiana. Maybe further. The Chitimacha treaties kept this place in balance for 10,000 years. The highway broke that balance. Now we hold it together through will and sacrifice. I thought about my daughter, about my wife, about the life I would be leaving behind. I thought about duty and obligation and the oath I swore to protect and serve. But mostly, I thought about all the people who would drive through this zone in the years to come. Innocent travelers who had no idea they were passing through a tear in reality, held together by guardians standing between worlds. "How does it work?" I asked. "What do I have to do?" My uncle reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder, and I felt cold spread through my body. Not painful, but absolute. A cold that went deeper than flesh and bone, touching something fundamental in my existence. "You accept the mark. You allow yourself to exist in multiple states simultaneously. You give up linear time, normal causality, the illusion of a single continuous self. In exchange, you gain awareness across all timelines, the ability to perceive and guide, to maintain the threshold. You'll still exist in the normal world. You'll still wear the uniform, drive the patrol car, file reports. But part of you will always be here, in the zone, watching, waiting, protecting." I felt the cold spreading, felt my consciousness expanding in ways that human language cannot adequately describe. I could see myself standing on the wooden bridge, and I could see myself in my patrol car, and I could see myself being born, and I could see myself dying, and I could see myself in 100 moments I hadn't lived yet, all existing simultaneously, all equally real. I could see the woman in the Honda, and I could see that she was also the same woman who disappeared in 1987,
and the same woman who would disappear in 2035. Because time in the zone isn't linear, it's a web, all moments touching, all possibilities existing at once. I could see my uncle standing next to me, and I could see the moment he accepted the mark in 1952, and I could see the Thibodeaux before him accepting it in 1847, and the one before that, and before that, stretching back through centuries of my family maintaining this threshold. The woman in the Honda, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, like it came from multiple throats at once. Can I save her? My uncle shook his head. She's already part of the zone. She entered at the wrong time, during a convergence point. She'll exist here now, in this moment, forever. You can guide her to acceptance, or you can let her resist until her mind breaks. Those are the only choices. I turned back to where the Honda had been, and I could see her now, not in a car, but standing among the crowd, looking confused and terrified, looking exactly as she had looked through the car window, frozen in that moment of terror, for eternity. How many? I asked. How many are trapped here? My uncle gestured to the assembled crowd. Everyone you see, plus thousands more you don't see, existing in other layers of the zone. Some have accepted, some are still resisting, some have transcended into something beyond human comprehension. All of them need guidance. All of them need a guardian. The cold had reached my chest now, and I could feel my heart beating in a rhythm that matched the distant drums I'd heard earlier. I realized the drums were heartbeats, the combined pulse of everyone who existed in the zone, beating in synchronization across time and space. My heart was joining that rhythm, becoming part of the eternal pulse of the threshold. Last chance, Marcus, my uncle said. You can walk away, drive back to Lafayette, file a report about a disabled vehicle that was gone when you arrived. Live your normal life. But the zone will still be here. The people will still disappear. And when your daughter's daughter reaches the right age, the call will come for her instead. The duty passes down. Someone must stand at the threshold. It can be you now, or it can be your descendants later. The choice is yours, but the responsibility remains. I thought about my daughter, 16 years old, full of life and promise and futures I wanted her to have. I thought about condemning her or her children to this choice, to this moment, to this transformation. I thought about all the anonymous travelers who would pass through this zone in the coming years, completely unaware of what surrounded them, protected only by guardians they would never see and sacrifices they would never know about. I thought about duty. I thought about service. I thought about what it really means to protect and serve, when the thing you're protecting people from is the collapse of reality itself. I accept, I said, and the cold reached my heart. The transformation was instantaneous and eternal. I could feel myself fragmenting across timelines, existing in multiple states simultaneously, experiencing every moment of my life at once. I was the boy in Lafayette, learning to fish with my grandfather. I was the young man graduating from the academy. I was the trooper pulling over speeders on I-10. I was the guardian standing at the threshold. I was the future version of myself explaining this to whoever came next. I was all of these things simultaneously, and none of them exclusively. I could see the highway in 1952, wooden bridges and dirt roads. I could see it in 2022, modern interstate with steel and concrete. I could see it in 2087, overgrown and abandoned, reclaimed by the swamp. I could see it in timelines where the highway was never built, where the Chitimacha treaties held, where the threshold remained undisturbed. All of these realities existed at once, layered on top of each other, separated by membranes thinner than thought. I became aware of the others, the guardians throughout time, all of us connected, all of us maintaining the threshold together. I could feel their thoughts, their memories, their endless duty. I understood now that my uncle hadn't disappeared. He had expanded. He existed in more states than the linear world could comprehend. And now, I existed in those same states. I could see people driving through the zone, completely unaware of the impossibility that surrounded them. I could see the ones who would become aware, the sensitive ones, the ones whose consciousness could perceive the overlapping realities. I could guide them, help them navigate, ease their transition if they were claimed by the zone. I could maintain the boundary, hold back the tide of temporal chaos that constantly pressed against the fragile structure we guardians maintained. I returned to my body, or rather, I returned to awareness of the body that existed in the 2022 timeline, standing next to my patrol car on Interstate 10 at mile marker 117. The Honda was gone. The woman was gone. My radio crackled to life with dispatch, asking for my status. I looked at my watch. 2,302 hours. 1 minute had passed since I arrived at the scene, though I had experienced hours, days, perhaps years in the zone. I keyed the radio. 10-8 dispatch. Vehicle was gone on arrival. Continuing patrol. My voice sounded normal to them, but I could hear the harmonic underneath it, the sound of someone existing in multiple states simultaneously, speaking with one voice across infinite timelines. The first week after the transformation was disorienting in ways I struggle to articulate even now. Imagine experiencing every moment of your life simultaneously, while also living in linear time. Imagine having breakfast with your family while simultaneously experiencing that same breakfast from the perspective of your future self, your past self, and infinite variations of yourself across branching timelines. Imagine driving to work while perceiving the same route as it existed in 1847, when it was a dirt wagon trail through cypress swamps, and in 1952, when it was a 2-lane blacktop, and in 2087, when it's overgrown and reclaimed by the bayou. Every moment contained layers, infinite regression of perspectives and possibilities, all equally real, all demanding attention. My wife noticed something was different. Sarah has always been perceptive, one of the reasons I fell in love with her 18 years ago. She didn't comment at first, just watched me with concerned eyes across the dinner table as I struggled to stay focused on the present moment, to keep my consciousness anchored in the 2022 timeline, when part of me was experiencing simultaneously serving dinner in our house in 2015 and sitting at the same table in 2031, watching our daughter graduate from college. "You seem distracted," Sarah said that first night home, and I could hear in her voice the unspoken question, the worry, the fear that something had changed between us. I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to explain that I had accepted a duty that stretched across timelines, that I now existed in multiple states simultaneously, that part of me would always be standing at the threshold in the Atchafalaya Basin, maintaining a boundary between realities. But how do you explain that to someone who exists in linear time? How do you tell your wife that you've transcended normal causality without sounding completely insane? Instead, I told her I had a difficult call, that I'd seen something disturbing on patrol, which was technically true. She accepted this explanation because she's been married to a cop for 14 years, and she understands that sometimes we see things that haunt us, that change us, that we can't discuss because they're too raw, or too classified, or too painful. She kissed my forehead and told me she loved me and that she was there if I needed to talk. I held her close and felt my consciousness splitting across timelines, experiencing this embrace as it happened in 1,000 different moments, in 1,000 different variations, in timelines where we met and married, and in timelines where we never crossed paths. All of it real, all of it true, all of it overwhelming. I learned to compartmentalize, to focus the majority of my awareness in the present timeline, while letting the others exist in background perception, like peripheral vision for consciousness itself. The second night, I dreamed, though calling it dreaming doesn't capture the experience. I existed in the zone fully, without the anchor of my physical body, perceiving the threshold in its totality. I saw the structure of it for the first time, the way it existed as a node point where multiple timelines intersected like threads in a vast cosmic weave. The Atchafalaya Basin zone was one of thousands of such nodes scattered across the planet, each one maintained by guardians who had accepted the transformation, each one serving as a pressure valve, preventing the temporal chaos from bleeding into the linear world. I could see the other guardians in their zones, could feel their consciousness touching mine across impossible distances. A park ranger in Yellowstone maintaining a threshold at Old Faithful, a tribal police officer on the Navajo reservation standing watch at a canyon where time fractured, a sheriff in West Texas guarding a section of highway where the desert remembered every person who had ever died in its vastness. All of us connected, all of us part of a network that predated modern civilization, that stretched back to the first humans who became aware that reality was more flexible than it appeared. I saw the Chitimacha understanding of the zone, their 10,000 years of maintaining the boundary through ritual and sacrifice and treaty with the entities that existed in the overlapping realities. They knew the zone as Kta-Hataya, the place where time forgets itself, and they had protocols for approaching it, for maintaining balance, for ensuring that the threshold remained stable. They understood that certain places on Earth existed as weak points in the membrane between times, that these places required guardians, that the duty of protection sometimes meant transformation beyond human understanding. They marked the boundaries with stones and totems, created oral traditions to pass down the knowledge, trained each generation in the responsibilities of maintaining the threshold. Then the French arrived, then the Spanish, then the Americans, and with each wave of colonization, more of the traditional knowledge was lost, more of the boundaries were violated, more of the balance was disrupted. The construction of Interstate 10 through the Atchafalaya Basin was the final straw, the modern act of hubris that shattered what remained of the Chitimacha protocols. In 1944, when the first survey crews entered the zone, they had no idea what they were disrupting. They saw only swampland to be drained, wilderness to be tamed, nature to be conquered with concrete and steel. They ignored the Chitimacha warnings, dismissed them as superstition, labeled the indigenous knowledge as primitive folklore. They built the highway directly through the heart of the threshold, creating a permanent structure that millions of people would pass through every year, completely unaware that they were driving across a tear in the fabric of temporal reality. The government knew almost immediately that something was wrong. Survey crews disappeared. Construction workers reported impossible experiences. Equipment failed in ways that violated basic physics. Time distortions became undeniable. That's when Operation Threshold was initiated in 1946. A classified program operated jointly by the Department of Interior, the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission, and military intelligence. The official purpose was to monitor and contain anomalous phenomena related to the highway construction. The real purpose was to find guardians who could maintain the threshold now that the traditional Chitimacha protocols had been shattered. They needed people with genetic connections to the land, with roots deep in the Bayou culture, with consciousness flexible enough to accept transformation. They found the Thibodeaux family. We had lived in these swamps for 200 years, descended from Acadian French settlers who intermarried with the Chitimacha, carrying genes and memories from both cultures. We were sensitive to the threshold, able to perceive the overlapping realities in ways that most people couldn't. We were perfect candidates for guardianship. My great-great-great-grandfather accepted the duty in 1847, after 147 members of a river expedition disappeared in the zone during a major convergence event. The number 147 kept recurring, appearing in incident reports across different eras, a pattern I didn't understand until I existed in the zone long enough to perceive that numbers themselves could be markers, synchronicities that indicated moments of heightened temporal activity. When 147 people disappeared or transformed, it signaled a critical threshold event, a moment when the boundary between times grew especially permeable and required guardian intervention. My grandfather served from 1902 until 1952, maintaining the threshold through 2 world wars, through the Depression, through the modernization of Louisiana from a primarily agricultural state to one dominated by oil and chemical industries. My uncle took over in 1952 and served until my transformation in 2022. Now, the duty was mine, would be mine until I trained a replacement, or until I existed long enough in expanded states that my consciousness transcended the need for a physical anchor entirely. The week after my transformation, I requested and received access to the classified Operation Threshold files. The Department of Homeland Security liaison, a woman named Dr. Rebecca Chen, who identified herself only as Anomalous Events Division, met me at a secured facility in New Orleans. She was in her 50s, Asian American, with the particular brand of weariness that comes from spending decades dealing with truths that most people would consider insanity. "Trooper Thibodeaux," she said, studying me with eyes that perceived more than they should. Or should I say, Guardian Thibodeaux? Your transformation signature is showing. Your eyes are already developing the characteristic reflective quality. I didn't ask how she could see this. People who worked for the Anomalous Events Division were typically sensitives themselves, individuals with genetic or experiential traits that allowed them to perceive temporal distortions without undergoing full guardian transformation. She led me into a room lined with filing cabinets and computer servers, the accumulated documentation of 78 years of classified anomaly research. Everything we know about the Atchafalaya Basin zone, Dr. Chen said, gesturing to the files. Incident reports, transformation case studies, timeline mapping, theoretical physics analysis, indigenous knowledge archives, everything. You have level 5 clearance now, which means you can access any material related to your zone. But Marcus, I need you to understand something before you start reading. Knowledge of the zone changes you. Every piece of information you absorb makes you more aware of the overlapping realities, makes it harder to maintain focus in the linear timeline. Some guardians go deep into the research and lose their ability to function in normal society. They become so aware of the multiple states that they can't hold a conversation without perceiving every possible variation of what they're saying across different timelines. Read carefully. Stay grounded. Remember that you still have a life in the 2022 timeline, a family who needs you to be present, not just physically, but consciously. I spent 3 days in that secured facility, reading through decades of documentation, and Dr. Chen's warning proved accurate. Each file I opened, each report I absorbed, each photograph I studied, made the linear world feel less solid, made the multiplicity of timelines more vivid and demanding. I read about the 147 disappeared in 1952, detailed case files on each individual. Martha Thibodeaux, 34, disappeared from her locked vehicle at mile marker 118. No signs of struggle, only a note left behind that read, "Time is a web. I can see all the threads now." Robert Guidry, 47, vanished during a routine traffic stop. His patrol car found idling with the door open, his last radio transmission consisting of Akkadian French phrases from a dialect that hadn't been spoken in 100 years. Claire Thibodeaux, 23, my uncle's sister, who entered the zone intentionally after learning about the family duty, whose transformation was so complete that she existed now as pure consciousness distributed across all timelines, no longer requiring a physical anchor point. I read the theoretical physics analysis, reports from scientists trying to understand the zone using the tools of modern science. They documented temporal distortions, measurable in milliseconds and hours, gravitational anomalies that suggested the presence of massive unseen structures, electromagnetic variations that indicated the intersection of multiple quantum states. They proposed theories about quantum entanglement across time, about consciousness as a non-local phenomenon capable of existing in superposition, about the universe as a multiverse where every possible timeline existed simultaneously, and certain geographical locations served as bridge points between them. None of their theories fully explained the zone, but they came close enough to make me respect their attempts to framework the incomprehensible in mathematical language. I read the Indigenous Knowledge Archives, collections of Chitimacha oral histories translated and preserved by anthropologists who had no idea they were documenting literal truth rather than metaphorical folklore. The stories described Atchafalaya as a place where the ancestors remained present, where those who entered could see past and future simultaneously, where the boundary between life and death dissolved into a continuous state of transformation. They described the original guardians, the Yahate warriors who accepted the duty of maintaining the threshold through ritual and sacrifice. They described the protocols for approaching the zone safely, the specific times when it was forbidden to enter, the offerings required to maintain balance, the ceremonies that kept the temporal chaos from spreading. All of this knowledge had been dismissed as primitive superstition by the modern world, even as that same modern world built a highway directly through what the Chitimacha knew was a dimensional weak point. The most disturbing files were the transformation case studies, detailed psychological and physiological profiles of individuals who had either accepted guardian duty or been claimed by the zone involuntarily. I read about the stages of transformation, the way consciousness fragmented across timelines before learning to maintain coherence, the physical changes that occurred as bodies adapted to existing in multiple states simultaneously. I saw photographs of guardians in various stages of transformation, their forms flickering between solidity and translucence, their eyes showing reflections of impossible geometries, their expressions mixing human emotion with something beyond human categorization. I read about the ones who resisted transformation, who fought against the expansion of consciousness, whose minds broke under the weight of perceiving multiple realities simultaneously. They existed now in states of eternal confusion, trapped in loops of their own resistance, unable to integrate and unable to return to linear existence. Dr. Chen found me on the third day, sitting in front of a computer screen displaying a timeline map of the Atchafalaya Basin zone, my consciousness so fragmented across timelines that I could barely remember which year I was physically occupying. "Marcus," she said gently, and I felt her presence as an anchor pulling me back toward the 2022 timeline. "You need to take a break. You're dissociating. Your wife called. Your daughter needs you to help with a school project. Remember the present moment. Remember your linear life." I blinked, refocused, pulled my awareness back from the infinite regression of possibilities. Dr. Chen was right. I had been losing my hold on the present, drifting deeper into the zone's perception, forgetting that I still had responsibilities in the solid world. "How long?" I asked, meaning how long could I maintain this balance between guardian duty and normal life? Dr. Chen's expression was sad and knowing. "Depends on the person. Your uncle managed for decades. Some guardians only last a few years before they transcend physical existence entirely. The key is maintaining rituals that keep you grounded, routines that anchor you in linear time. Family dinners, coaching your daughter's basketball games, regular work shifts, small touchstones of normality that remind you which timeline is primary." I went home that night and held my daughter while she explained her history project about Louisiana in the Civil War. I listened to Sarah talk about her day, about the mundane frustrations of her work as a nurse, about our plans for vacation next month. I mowed the lawn, paid bills, did laundry, all the ordinary activities that most people take for granted, but that for me became sacred rituals, deliberate acts of staying present in the linear timeline. And every night at 0333 hours, whether I was asleep or awake, my consciousness would snap back to the threshold zone, would spend those peak hours of temporal permeability, maintaining the boundary, guiding lost souls, keeping the overlapping realities from bleeding into each other catastrophically. I learned to live in both worlds simultaneously, the guardian who existed across all timelines, and the husband and father who existed in the solid present moment. And I learned that the second role was just as important as the first, that maintaining humanity was part of maintaining the threshold, that guardians who forgot their anchor in the linear world became lost in the zone's infinite possibilities. The first guided transformation I performed happened 3 months after my own acceptance of guardian duty. It was a young man named David Ebert, 26 years old, descended from Cajun fishermen who had worked these waters for generations. He had been driving through the zone at 0327 hours when his truck's engine died, all electronics failed simultaneously, and he found himself standing on a wooden pier that extended into swamp water that glowed with bioluminescent light, surrounded by people who spoke to him in voices that resonated in his chest cavity rather than his ears. He called 911 from his cell phone the moment he regained signal after driving another 3 miles east. Dispatch routed the call to me because I had quietly made it known to my supervisors that I had specific training in dealing with what they euphemistically called basin anomaly incidents. I found David parked at a rest stop near mile marker 125, sitting in his truck with the windows rolled up, despite the humid Louisiana night. Every light in the vehicle turned on, radio playing loud classic rock, like he was trying to drown out something only he could hear. When I tapped on his window, He jumped so violently that he hit his head on the roof. His eyes, when he looked at me, were wide with terror and confusion, and I could see the beginnings of the transformation signature, a slight reflective quality to his irises that indicated he had perceived enough of the zone to begin the change, whether he wanted to or not. "Trooper," he said when he rolled down the window, his voice shaking, "I know how this sounds. I know what you're going to think, but I swear to God I was standing in water that glowed blue, and there were people there, dozens of them, and they were asking me to stay, and I could hear my grandfather's voice, even though he's been dead for 10 years, and time didn't work right. I was there for what felt like hours, but my phone says only 7 minutes passed." I could have told him he was hallucinating, could have followed the standard protocol of taking him to the hospital for a psychological evaluation, could have maintained the official fiction that nothing unusual happens in the Atchafalaya Basin. Instead, I sat down on the hood of his truck and told him the truth. "David, I'm going to explain something to you, and I need you to listen carefully without interrupting. What you experienced in the zone was real. All of it. The people you saw, the conversations you had, the feeling that time wasn't flowing normally. It's all real. The Atchafalaya Basin between mile markers 115 and 121 exists as a threshold between timelines, a place where past, present, and future overlap, where the boundary between what was and what is becomes permeable. You have genetic sensitivity to the phenomenon, probably inherited from your Cajun ancestors who fished these waters when they still understood that some places don't follow normal rules. The zone recognized this sensitivity and showed itself to you. Now you have a choice to make." He stared at me like I had lost my mind, which was understandable. "Are you serious right now? Is this some kind of test? Are you recording this?" I showed him my eyes, let him see the reflective quality that marked me as guardian. "I'm completely serious. Look at my eyes, David. Really look. You'll see what I'm talking about. I'm the same as you now, someone who's perceived the zone, someone who exists in multiple states. I made my choice 3 months ago. Now you're making yours. You can walk away. You can go back to your normal life. The memories will fade, become dreamlike, something you dismiss as a weird experience you had on the highway. Or you can accept what you've seen, lean into the transformation, and become a guardian like me. If you choose the second path, you'll never be normal again. You'll exist across timelines. You'll perceive realities that most people don't know exist. You'll have responsibilities that extend beyond the visible world. But you'll also be part of something ancient and necessary. You'll help maintain the boundary that keeps reality stable. You'll guide others through the transition when they stumble into the zone unprepared." David sat in silence for a long time, processing. I could see his mind working, could perceive the moment when he made the shift from trying to rationalize what he'd experienced to accepting that rationality had limits, that the world was stranger than he'd been taught. "My grandfather," he said slowly, "he told me stories when I was a kid, about the deep water in the basin, about places where the ancestors still walked, about family duty that passed down through generations. I thought they were just stories, Cajun folklore to entertain children. But he was trying to prepare me, wasn't he? He knew this was coming." I nodded. "Your grandfather was probably sensitive too. Maybe he encountered the zone. Maybe he just knew the old stories well enough to recognize their truth. Either way, yes, he was preparing you." The question is whether you're ready to accept what he was preparing you for. Over the next 3 hours, I guided David through his first conscious experience of the zone. We drove back to mile marker 117, parked our vehicles, and, at 0333 hours, we stepped together into the threshold. I showed him how to maintain consciousness across multiple timelines, how to perceive the layers of reality without becoming lost in them, how to communicate with the entities and transformed individuals who existed in the overlapping states. I introduced him to my uncle, who welcomed him with the same sad understanding he had shown me. I explained the history, the protocols, the responsibilities. And I watched as David made the same choice I had made. As the cold spread through his body,
As his consciousness fragmented and then reformed in expanded configuration, as he became guardian. The transformation hit David harder than it had hit me. He spent 2 weeks unable to maintain coherent presence in the linear timeline, his consciousness so fragmented that he would start sentences in 2022 and finish them referencing events from 1887. His family thought he was having a breakdown. His girlfriend left him because he kept talking about conversations they'd had in timelines that didn't exist in her experience. He lost his job as a commercial fisherman because he couldn't focus on the present task, when he was simultaneously experiencing that same task across 100 different moments. I stayed with him through the worst of it, providing the guidance my uncle had provided for me, teaching him the techniques for maintaining coherence, for anchoring himself in the primary timeline while still fulfilling guardian duties. Eventually, after about 6 weeks, David stabilized. He learned to live in both worlds. He went back to fishing, but now he also maintained the threshold, adding his consciousness to the network of guardians, strengthening the boundary, expanding our capacity to guide others through the transformation. That was the first of 23 transformations I would guide over the next 3 years. Each one was different. Each person responded to the expansion of consciousness in their own way. Each required individualized support and teaching. Some adapted quickly, some struggled for months, some never fully stabilized and had to be guided toward accepting a more complete transcendence, releasing their physical anchor and existing purely as distributed consciousness across timelines. I learned to recognize the signs of someone who was ready for transformation versus someone who would resist to the point of psychological break. I learned to approach people gently, to give them time to process, to respect their choice if they decided to walk away.
And I learned the weight of responsibility that comes with being the person who guides others into existence, states that most humans can't comprehend. May 17th, 2023 brought the first major convergence event during my guardianship. Convergence events happen when multiple timelines align in ways that create massive temporal disturbances, when the boundary between times becomes so permeable that even non-sensitive individuals can perceive the overlapping realities. The last major convergence in the Atchafalaya Basin had occurred in 1952, resulting in 147 disappearances and requiring my uncle to perform mass guidance operations that nearly shattered his own consciousness from the strain. I had been trained for convergence events through the Operation Threshold documentation, through my uncle's experiences transmitted across our shared guardian consciousness, through theoretical scenarios and worst-case planning. But experiencing one directly was different from any preparation. The signs started 3 days before the actual convergence. The zone expanded, its boundaries pushing outward from the usual 6-mile stretch between markers 115 and 121 to encompass nearly 15 miles of highway. Temperature anomalies became frequent and severe, with motorists reporting their car thermometers showing -40 degrees while their skin felt burning hot. GPS systems failed across the entire region, showing coordinates that placed vehicles everywhere from the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico to the middle of Lake Pontchartrain. Radio communications degraded into pure static, punctuated by voices speaking languages from across centuries. Wildlife behavior became erratic, with alligators crawling up onto the highway in broad daylight, flocks of birds flying in geometrically impossible formations, fish leaping from the swamp water in synchronized patterns that looked like choreography. I felt the convergence approaching before any of the visible signs manifested. My consciousness started experiencing increased fragmentation, my awareness spreading involuntarily across more timelines than I normally maintained, my perception extending backward and forward through time in ways that made basic tasks like driving or conversation nearly impossible. Sarah noticed and immediately took our daughter to stay with her sister in Shreveport, far from the basin, understanding without me having to explain that something dangerous was approaching and our family needed distance. Dr. Chen contacted me directly, her voice tight with controlled alarm. "Marcus, we're registering massive temporal distortions centered on your zone. Whatever's coming, it's going to be the biggest event since 1952. You need to prepare for mass guidance operations. We're estimating somewhere between 100 and 200 individuals might become aware of the zone during the peak of the convergence. You'll need to process and guide all of them, and you'll need to do it while maintaining the boundary integrity to prevent complete timeline collapse. Can you handle this?" Could I handle this? I didn't know. 3 years of Guardian experience versus a phenomenon that my uncle with 47 years of service had barely survived. But I also knew I didn't have a choice. I was the only active Guardian for this zone. David was still too new to handle this level of crisis. My uncle existed in too fragmented a state to reassemble enough coherence for major operations. It was on me. And the alternative was allowing the convergence to spiral out of control, potentially creating a permanent tear in temporal reality that would spread far beyond the Louisiana Bayou. "I'll handle it," I told Dr. Chen, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "What support can you provide?" Her answer was not encouraging. "The Anomalous Events Division will establish a perimeter at mile markers 110 and 126. We'll divert all traffic away from the zone, shut down the highway under the cover of emergency maintenance. But inside that perimeter, you're on your own. Our people can't operate in high convergence environments without losing their minds. This is Guardian work, Marcus. This is what you trained for." May 17th, 2023, 03:33 hours. The convergence peaked. I was standing at mile marker 117, the geographic center of the zone, and reality was dissolving around me in ways that made my initial transformation experience look stable and coherent by comparison. The highway existed in at least 147 different temporal states simultaneously. I could see it as a dirt trail from the early 1800s. I could see it as the wooden bridge structure my uncle showed me from 1952. I could see it as the modern interstate from 2022. I could see it overgrown and abandoned from possible futures in 2087, 2143, 2298. I could see it as Chitimacha sacred ground from 10,000 years ago, marked with stones and totems, water flowing where asphalt should be. All of these realities occupied the same space, overlapping, intersecting, bleeding into each other. And the people, hundreds of them, appearing from all directions, all time periods, all states of existence. Motorists from 2022, whose cars had died in the zone, standing confused and terrified beside vehicles that flickered between visibility and invisibility. Travelers from 1952, 1887, 1824, all dressed in period clothing, all equally disoriented. Confederate soldiers who had died in the swamps during the Civil War, still wearing their muddy uniforms, still carrying weapons that phased between solid metal and ghostly light. Chitimacha warriors from pre-colonial times, painted for ceremony, speaking in languages that hadn't been heard in centuries. And the transformed ones, the previous victims of the zone, who existed now in states of partial transcendence, their forms shifting between human and something beyond human categorization, their voices harmonizing in ways that spoke directly to consciousness rather than through sound waves. All of them were aware. All of them could perceive the overlapping timelines. All of them were experiencing the existential terror of having their understanding of reality completely shattered. And all of them were looking to me, the guardian, for guidance, for explanation, for rescue from an impossibility that their minds couldn't process. I felt the weight of their collective confusion and fear, pressing against my expanded consciousness like physical force. I felt the boundary between timelines stretching, weakening, threatening to snap and allow complete temporal chaos to flood through the breach. I felt my own coherence fragmenting under the strain of trying to maintain presence across so many overlapping realities simultaneously. This was the moment my uncle had warned me about. The moment when a guardian either transcends into pure consciousness, capable of holding together massive convergences, or breaks completely and becomes another lost soul, trapped in the zone's eternal confusion. I had seconds to make a choice. I could try to maintain my individual consciousness, my sense of self, my anchor in the linear timeline, and I would fail, would shatter, would add my fragmented awareness to the chaos instead of resolving it. Or I could let go, could allow my consciousness to expand beyond human limits, could become temporarily what the most advanced guardians eventually became permanently. Distributed awareness existing across all affected timelines simultaneously, holding the pattern together through sheer force of integrated perception. I let go. I allowed my consciousness to fragment and expand, to distribute across the 147 overlapping timelines that the convergence had activated. I became aware of myself in every temporal state simultaneously. I was Marcus Thibodeaux, Louisiana State Trooper standing in 2022. I was Marcus Thibodeaux, Guardian, existing across timelines. I was pure awareness without individual identity, perceiving the entire structure of the convergence from outside temporal sequencing. I was the boundary itself, the membrane between times, the conscious pattern that held separation and prevented collapse. I was all of these states at once, and I was none of them exclusively. From this expanded state, I could perceive what needed to happen. I could see the pattern of guidance required, the specific interventions needed for each confused soul trapped in the convergence. I began to work, operating across all timelines simultaneously. For the 2022 motorists who were sensitive but unprepared, I appeared as a normal state trooper, calm and authoritative, explaining that they had experienced a localized phenomenon, that they should continue driving east or west out of the affected area, that the memories would fade and integrate as dreams. For those with stronger sensitivity, those who were potential guardians, I showed them the truth gently, gave them the choice clearly, guided them toward either acceptance or deliberate forgetting. For the historical figures trapped in temporal loops, I helped them understand that they existed now in eternal states, that their original timelines had long passed, that they could either resist and suffer or accept and find peace in expanded existence. The work took hours and seconds simultaneously. Time had no meaning in the convergent state. I was guiding individuals through transformation while also maintaining the boundary integrity, while also distributing my awareness across timelines, while also staying partially anchored in my 2022 body to prevent complete transcendence. I felt my physical form aging, felt the strain manifesting as gray in my hair, lines deepening in my face, my heart struggling to maintain rhythm across so many states simultaneously. I felt my human identity thinning, becoming more abstraction than reality, the weight of family and personal history seeming less substantial compared to the eternal duty of holding timelines in pattern. Then I felt other presences joining mine. David had arrived, his consciousness young and uncertain, but adding strength to the boundary maintenance. My uncle's distributed awareness reassembled enough to provide support, his decades of experience flowing through our shared guardian network. And others, guardians from distant zones, extending their consciousness across hundreds of miles to reinforce the Atchafalaya threshold. A park ranger from Yellowstone, a sheriff from West Texas, a tribal officer from the Navajo lands, a forest ranger from Mammoth Cave. All of us connecting, our collective consciousness forming a web that could hold the convergence stable, while individual guidance operations continued. Together, we processed 187 souls through transformation, acceptance, or guided forgetting. We maintained the boundary for 4 hours and 17 minutes of linear time, though the experience felt both eternal and instantaneous from within the expanded state. We prevented timeline collapse. We kept the convergence from spreading beyond the established zone boundaries. We upheld the duty that guardians have maintained for 10,000 years, the responsibility of standing at thresholds, of maintaining separation between times, of protecting both the linear world and the eternal web from catastrophic intersection. When the convergence finally released, when the timelines settled back into their normal overlapping state, when the boundary stabilized and no longer required active maintenance, I collapsed back into singular consciousness with a shock that felt like being born and dying simultaneously. I was standing exactly where I had started, at mile marker 117, and my watch showed 0750 hours. 4 hours and 17 minutes had passed. My patrol car was still there. The highway looked normal, solid concrete and painted lines, everyday reality, without visible overlapping states. But I could feel that I had changed in fundamental ways. I had stretched my consciousness beyond limits I hadn't known existed. I had touched pure, distributed awareness. I had experienced what it meant to be pattern rather than person, to be consciousness without identity, to be guardian in the fullest sense of what that word implied. And I knew I couldn't go back to my previous level of integration. The convergence had pushed me too far toward transcendence. I could still maintain presence in the linear timeline, could still function as husband and father and state trooper. But these roles felt more like performances now, choices I was making rather than natural states of being. Part of me would always exist in that expanded state, always be distributed across timelines, always be more guardian than human. Dr. Chen found me an hour later, sitting in my patrol car, staring at nothing, my eyes showing such pronounced reflective quality that she could see the timeline patterns flickering in my irises. "You held it," she said, and I could hear genuine relief in her voice. The convergence didn't collapse. You guided them through. Marcus, You saved potentially thousands of lives, prevented a temporal catastrophe that could have destabilized the entire Gulf Coast region. But the cost shows on you. You pushed further toward transcendence than most guardians ever need to. You might not be able to maintain linear existence much longer. She was right. Over the weeks following the convergence, I found it increasingly difficult to stay anchored in the 2022 timeline. I would be having dinner with Sarah and suddenly be experiencing the same dinner from 2019, 2025, 2031, all simultaneously. I would be coaching my daughter's basketball game and perceive every possible outcome of every play across branching timelines. I would be filing a routine traffic report and see the words exist in states of quantum superposition, simultaneously written and unwritten, existing in all possible phrasings at once. The weight of distributed consciousness was pulling me toward permanent transcendence, toward releasing my physical anchor and existing purely as awareness across all timelines. I drove away from mile marker 117, and I could feel the zone behind me, always present, always calling. I could feel the weight of the threshold, the responsibility of maintaining it. I continued my patrol, completed my shift, went home to my wife and daughter, acted normal, filed normal reports, lived a normal life. But part of me was always in the zone, always standing at the threshold, always watching, always guiding. When people disappeared in the basin, I knew why. When travelers reported strange experiences, lost time, impossible visions, I understood what they had glimpsed. When other troopers asked why I always volunteered for the mile marker 115 to 121 patrol, I told them I liked the peace and quiet of the basin. I didn't tell them I was maintaining a dimensional threshold that protected the entire timeline from collapse. The research came later, in stolen hours and quiet moments. I found the classified files, the Operation Threshold documentation, the records of 147 disappeared persons in 1952, the same number as an earlier incident in 1847, the same number as a Chitimacha story about 147 spirits who guard the place where time forgets itself. I found maps showing the zone boundaries, always the same 6 miles, always between markers 115 and 121, always at the exact point where the Atchafalaya Basin's waters run deepest and oldest. I found documentation of similar zones around the world, places where the boundary between times grows thin, all of them guarded, all of them monitored, all of them maintained by people like me who have accepted the transformation and the duty. I found my uncle's journal, hidden in a safety deposit box he'd arranged for me to inherit. Detailed observations from 47 years of service. I read about the convergence points, the specific times when the zone becomes most active. 3:33 a.m., the witching hour's darker reflection. The equinoxes and solstices when temporal boundaries grow most permeable. The anniversary dates of major traumas when echoes of violence resonate across timelines. I learned the protocols for guiding people through acceptance, for easing their transformation, for helping them understand that what they thought was death was actually expansion, that what they feared was loss of self was actually multiplication of consciousness across infinite states of being. 3 years have passed since February 15th, 2022, in linear time. But I've experienced those 3 years simultaneously with every other moment of my existence, and with every moment that has ever occurred in the zone. I've guided 23 people through the transformation. I've prevented the threshold from collapsing 4 times during major convergence events. I've maintained the boundary while standing in multiple timelines simultaneously, while existing as both guardian and ordinary trooper, as both human and something that transcends human categorization. I wear the mark of the zone. When I look in the mirror, my eyes reflect light differently, showing glimpses of other timelines, other realities. My heart beats in rhythm with the eternal pulse of the threshold. My consciousness extends across temporal boundaries that most people don't even know exist. Sarah knows now. Not everything, because some aspects of guardian existence can't be explained in linear language, but enough to understand why I sometimes stare at nothing for hours. Why I wake at 0333 every morning, regardless of when I sleep. Why our daughter shows signs of the same sensitivity I carry and will eventually face the same choice I faced. Sarah doesn't ask me to choose between my family and my duty, because she understands they're the same thing, that maintaining the threshold is how I protect everyone I love. That my sacrifice means our daughter and her children will grow up in a world where reality remains stable, where the temporal chaos stays contained, where the boundaries between times hold. My daughter Amelie is 17 now, and I can see the sensitivity developing in her. She mentions dreams of standing in swamps that glow with bioluminescent light, of hearing voices speaking Old French, of feeling like time moves differently when she drives past certain areas. I haven't told her directly about the zone or the family duty, but I've started the subtle preparation my grandfather attempted with me, sharing stories, dropping hints, watching for the moment when she becomes ready to understand. Sometimes I perceive timelines where she accepts the transformation young, becomes a guardian by age 20, serves alongside me for decades before I fully transcend. Sometimes I see timelines where she resists, where the duty passes to her children instead, where she lives a normal life, unaware of what I protected her from. I don't know which timeline will manifest as primary in her experience. That's not how temporal perception works. All possibilities exist simultaneously until consciousness collapses them into specific experience. And even then, the other possibilities don't disappear, they just become less accessible to linear awareness. Last month, 3 more people entered the zone during a minor convergence point. I guided 2 of them to acceptance. They're adapting now, learning to maintain coherence, beginning to understand their role in the network of guardians. The third was a woman named Jennifer Arsenault, 31 years old, descended from some of the same Acadian families as my own ancestors. She had the sensitivity, had the genetic markers, had everything necessary for successful transformation. But she resisted.
She fought against the expansion of consciousness with a ferocity that made guidance impossible. I tried every technique I knew, every approach my uncle had taught me, every protocol documented in the Operation Threshold files. Nothing worked. Her mind couldn't accept the multiplicity of timelines, couldn't integrate the perception of overlapping realities, couldn't release its grip on linear causality and singular identity. Now Jennifer exists, trapped in the zone, in a state of eternal resistance, her consciousness fragmenting and reassembling in loops, experiencing her moment of terror over and over across infinite iterations, unable to move forward into acceptance and unable to return to linear existence. I visit her presence in the zone regularly, trying to ease her suffering, but she doesn't recognize me anymore, doesn't recognize anything except her own fear. She exists as warning, as reminder of what happens when transformation is forced rather than chosen. When someone crosses the threshold without preparation or willingness, I carry the weight of her suffering as part of my guardian duty,
as motivation to be better at identification, to only guide those who are truly ready, to respect the immense psychological cost that transformation demands. A new trooper joined my sector 6 months ago. Her name is Officer Michelle Landry, and she's 24 years old, fresh out of the academy, eager and competent, and showing all the signs of sensitivity that indicate she might be called to guardian duty. She's descended from old Louisiana families, has Chitimacha ancestry mixed with French and African heritage, carries the complex genetic signature that seems to predispose certain individuals toward threshold perception. I've been watching her carefully, noting how she reacts when patrol routes take her through the zone, observing whether she notices the subtle anomalies that most people's brains automatically filter out. So far, she's perceptive, but not aware, noticing that something feels different about the mile markers between 115 and 121, but not yet understanding what that difference signifies. I've started the preparation process, the same way my uncle prepared me, though I'm being more deliberate and conscious about it than he was. I tell her stories during quiet patrol hours, accounts framed as folklore and legend, but containing enough truth that they'll serve as framework when she eventually perceives the zone directly. I share Chitimacha oral traditions, explain the old beliefs about places where ancestors walk, describe the Akkadian understanding of thin places where the veil between worlds grows permeable. Michelle listens with polite interest, filing it away as cultural knowledge, not yet understanding that I'm teaching her the vocabulary she'll need to comprehend her own transformation when and if it comes. I don't know if she'll be my replacement or my colleague, whether she'll take over when I fully transcend, or whether she'll join David and me as part of an expanded guardian network. The timelines remain in superposition until events collapse them into specificity. The research continues. I've spent 3 years now studying the classified files, the theoretical analyses, the historical documentation, and I understand the zone in ways that would have been impossible before transformation. I understand now that the Atchafalaya Basin threshold isn't a random anomaly, isn't an accident of geography or physics. It exists because the Chitimacha made it exist. Through 10,000 years of conscious intention and ritual maintenance, deliberately creating a node point where timelines could intersect in controlled ways, where the ancestors could remain accessible, where the membrane between linear and eternal existence could be navigated safely by trained practitioners. The zone was their technology, their method of maintaining continuity between generations, their solution to the problem of mortality and the loss of accumulated wisdom. Then, colonization disrupted the protocols, broke the ritual cycles, killed the trained practitioners before they could pass on their full knowledge. The zone didn't disappear when the Chitimacha culture was shattered because it had existed for too long, had too much momentum, had become too deeply embedded in the fabric of local reality. But without proper maintenance, without the rituals and offerings and conscious intention that kept it stable, the zone began to behave erratically. The boundaries fluctuated. The temporal distortions intensified. People started disappearing not because they were being welcomed into eternal existence as part of a cultural practice, but because they were stumbling into an uncontrolled phenomenon that no longer distinguished between willing participants and random travelers. The highway construction was the final destabilization, the modern intervention that forced the zone into crisis state. Building a permanent structure directly through a dimensional threshold, channeling millions of unconscious travelers through a weak point in temporal reality, this created pressure that the zone couldn't accommodate without Guardian intervention. That's what Operation Threshold really addresses, not controlling the zone, but compensating for the loss of the original Chitimacha maintenance protocols, substituting individual Guardian consciousness for the collective ritual practice that used to keep the threshold stable. We Guardians are stopgap measures, individual human consciousnesses stretched beyond normal limits in order to accomplish what used to require entire communities working in synchronized ceremony. It's not sustainable. Dr. Chen admits this in our periodic debriefing sessions. The Guardian network is thin, too few individuals maintaining too many thresholds, the weight of duty gradually pushing each of us toward transcendence and leaving the zones unprotected until new Guardians can be identified and transformed. The Department of Homeland Security knows this is a failing system, knows that eventually we'll reach a critical point where there aren't enough Guardians to maintain the boundaries, where the temporal chaos will break through despite our efforts. They're researching alternatives, trying to develop technological solutions, attempting to reverse engineer the Chitimacha rituals from incomplete historical records, exploring whether collective human consciousness can be trained to provide the same stabilizing effect that indigenous protocols achieved. But so far, nothing has proven as effective as individual Guardian transformation, and nothing suggests that will change in the foreseeable timelines. This means I'm training Michelle not just as courtesy or tradition, but as urgent necessity. If she has the sensitivity, if she can accept the transformation, if she can learn to maintain boundaries while still functioning in linear society, then she represents hope for continuing the Guardian network when I inevitably transcend beyond useful service. And I can feel that transcendence approaching. The Convergence event in May 2023 pushed me too far toward distributed consciousness. My anchor in the linear timeline grows weaker each month. I spend more time now existing across multiple states simultaneously than I spend focused in the present moment. My family sees me less and less, even when I'm physically present, because my consciousness is increasingly elsewhere, spread across timelines, maintaining boundaries, guiding transformations, becoming pattern rather than person. Sarah held me last week and said, "You're leaving me, aren't you? Not because you want to, but because you have to. You're becoming something that can't stay in one time, one place, one life anymore." I couldn't deny it. She deserves honesty, even when honesty means admitting that I'm slowly dissolving into the duty I accepted, that the Marcus she married is fragmenting across temporal states, that eventually there won't be enough coherence left to maintain a singular identity, a singular relationship, a singular presence in her timeline. "How long?" she asked, and I told her the truth. "I don't know. Maybe months, maybe years. Maybe I can hold on longer if I have reasons to stay anchored. But eventually, I'll exist more in the zone than in the linear world, more as guardian than as husband or father. That's what this duty means. That's what transformation costs." She cried, but not from weakness or surrender. Sarah has always been strong, has always understood that love sometimes means releasing what you hold most dear. Then we make the time we have count, she said. We live deliberately, consciously, appreciating every moment I have with the version of you that's still here. And when you fully transcend, I'll know you're still existing somewhere, across all those timelines you talk about, still protecting people, still fulfilling the duty that makes you who you are. I won't grieve you as dead, because you won't be dead. You'll just be existing in ways I can't perceive directly, in states I can't understand fully. But you'll still be the man I love, just distributed across realities instead of concentrated in one body, one time, one place. I held her and felt the weight of love across timelines, the way our relationship existed in every possible variation, the moments we shared echoing across infinite states of being. This is what makes transcendence difficult. Not the letting go of physical existence, but the release of specific connections, particular relationships, the concrete love shared with individuals who exist in singular timelines. When I fully transcend, I'll carry these memories, these connections, but they'll become abstract rather than immediate. Patterns I perceive rather than experiences I inhabit. Sarah understands this better than I expected anyone could. Understands that duty requires sacrifice, that protection sometimes costs everything we value most, that serving means becoming something beyond what we started as. Amelie came to me yesterday with questions I'd been dreading and anticipating simultaneously. She's at the age now where the sensitivity can no longer be ignored, where the strange experiences and impossible perceptions demand explanation beyond what comfortable lies can provide. We sat on the back porch, watching the sun set over the bayou, and she asked me directly, "Dad, am I going crazy? I keep having these dreams, or maybe they're not dreams, where I'm standing in water that glows blue, and there are people talking to me in old French, and you're there, but you're also not there, like you exist in multiple places at once. And when I drive with you past mile marker 117 on I-10, I swear I can see other versions of the highway underneath the concrete. Wooden bridges and dirt roads and overgrown paths all stacked on top of each other. Am I losing my mind? Or is something real happening to me?" This was the moment, the choice point. I could maintain the comfortable fiction, could tell her these were just dreams and stress responses, could encourage her towards psychological evaluation and medication that would dull the sensitivity without addressing its source. Or I could honor her with truth, could begin the real preparation, could help her understand what she was perceiving and what choices lay ahead. I chose truth, the same way my uncle eventually chose truth with me, because denying someone's direct perception of reality is a cruelty that serves no one except those who benefit from ignorance. You're not crazy, Amelie. You're perceiving something real, something that most people can't see because they're not genetically or psychologically configured to notice it. You're seeing the Atchafalaya Basin threshold, the place where timelines overlap, where past and future and present exist simultaneously in layered states. And yes, you're seeing me exist in multiple places at once, because I do exist in multiple places at once. I'm a guardian, someone who maintains the boundary between temporal states, someone who accepted transformation in order to protect people from what happens when those boundaries collapse. I told her everything about the Thibodeaux family duty stretching back through generations, about the Chitimacha protocols and their disruption, about Operation Threshold and the Guardian Network, about my transformation on February 15th, 2022, and the Convergence event in May 2023, about the choice she would eventually face, the same choice every Thibodeaux with sensitivity confronts, the decision between normal life and expanded consciousness, between linear existence and eternal duty. I showed her my eyes, let her see the reflective quality, the timeline patterns flickering in my irises. I took her to the zone at 03:33 hours and guided her through controlled perception, letting her see the overlapping realities with my protection, giving her direct experience of what the threshold truly was. Amelie processed this with remarkable composure for a 17-year-old who had just learned that reality was far stranger than she'd been taught, that her father existed in states beyond normal human comprehension, that she carried the same genetic markers and would eventually face the same transformation. "How long do I have before I have to choose?" she asked. And I appreciated that she asked how long rather than if. She understood already that this wasn't a theoretical possibility, but an approaching certainty, that sensitivity like hers didn't fade or disappear. It only intensified until some crisis point forced decision. "I don't know exactly," I told her honestly. "Could be months, could be years. The zone will call you when you're ready, or when circumstances force the issue. But knowing about it now, being prepared, having framework to understand the experience, this makes transformation less traumatic, makes the choice more conscious rather than reactive." She asked if she could refuse, could resist transformation and live normally despite the sensitivity. I told her the truth about that too, about Jennifer Arsenault trapped in eternal loops of terror, about others who resisted and broke under the weight of perceiving realities they couldn't integrate. "Resistance is possible but costly," I explained. "If you're called to guardian duty and you refuse, you don't just return to normal life. The perception remains. The awareness of overlapping timelines continues, but without the expanded consciousness necessary to process that awareness. You'd exist in constant confusion, in perpetual existential crisis, seeing things you can't understand, experiencing temporal distortions you can't control. Most people who resist transformation either go functionally insane or find ways to suppress their perception through substances or behaviors that are destructive in their own ways. The healthier choice, if you're called, is acceptance. Leaning into the expansion rather than fighting it, becoming guardian rather than remaining someone who perceives the zone without the tools to navigate it. Amelie sat in silence for a long time, watching the bayou water reflect moonlight, thinking about a future that had suddenly become far more complex and strange than she had imagined. Finally, she said, "I want to prepare. I want to learn what you can teach me. I want to be ready when the call comes, whenever that is. If this is family duty, if Thibodeaux have been doing this for generations, if you're serving now and will eventually need someone to continue the work, then I want to approach it consciously, with knowledge and preparation, not stumbling into it unprepared and terrified." I felt pride and grief simultaneously. Joy that my daughter had her mother's courage and strength, sorrow that she would walk the same difficult path I walked, that she would make the same sacrifices, that she would eventually face the same slow dissolution into duty that I now experienced. The last month has been intensive preparation with Amelie, teaching her everything I can while I still maintain enough coherence in the linear timeline to serve as effective instructor. I've taken her to the Operation Threshold facility in New Orleans, introduced her to Dr. Chen, let her read the classified files. I've guided her through controlled zone perceptions, helping her develop the mental frameworks necessary for maintaining coherence across multiple timelines. I've introduced her to David and to my uncle's distributed consciousness, showing her what guardians look like at different stages of service and transcendence. I've taught her the theoretical physics, the indigenous histories, the practical protocols for guiding others through transformation. And I've been honest about the costs, about what this duty demands, about the slow erosion of normal human existence that guardianship requires. Michelle suspects something now. She's perceptive enough to notice that I'm spending extra time with my daughter, that we're having intense conversations, that Amelie is changing in subtle ways that mirror the changes Michelle has observed in me. She asked me directly last week if there was something about the basin I wasn't telling her, if the strange feelings she got between mile markers 115 and 121 had an explanation beyond folklore and legend. I told her there was, that when she was ready, I would explain everything, but that some knowledge carried weight she might not want to bear, responsibilities she might not want to accept. "Tell me," she insisted. "I'm a state trooper. I can handle difficult truths." But I know from experience that handling difficult truths about procedure and crime is different from handling existential truths about the nature of reality itself. I asked her to be patient, to trust that when the time was right, I would provide full explanation. She accepted this reluctantly, but I can see the curiosity intensifying, the sensitivity developing, the approaching moment when she'll perceive the zone directly and demand answers I'll have to provide. The Department of Homeland Security is concerned about guardian transition planning. Dr. Chen has been pushing me to accelerate Michelle's preparation, to get her transformed and trained before I transcend beyond useful communication. "We can't afford to lose the Atchafalaya Basin zone to instability," she said in our last meeting. "If you fully transcend before we have a functional replacement guardian, the threshold could collapse, could create a cascade effect that destabilizes other zones along the Gulf Coast. You need to transform Michelle now, Marcus, not wait for organic timing. We need operational guardians, not potential guardians." But I resist this pressure, because I've seen what happens when transformation is forced rather than chosen, when people are pushed into guardian duty before they're psychologically ready. Jennifer Arsenault exists in eternal suffering because someone decided operational necessity mattered more than individual readiness. I won't make that mistake with Michelle. Won't sacrifice her well-being for institutional convenience. Won't let the Department of Homeland Security's timeline preferences override what I know about safe transformation protocols. Instead, I'm training Amelie intensively, preparing her to serve as bridge guardian, someone who can maintain basic threshold stability if I transcend before Michelle is ready for full transformation. Amelie won't be able to handle major convergence events or complex guidance operations at her level of preparation. But she can maintain boundaries, can keep the zone from expanding catastrophically, can provide basic assistance to travelers who stumble into temporal distortions. It's not ideal having someone so young and inexperienced serving as primary guardian, but it's better than leaving the threshold completely unattended. And Amelie has advantages I didn't have, has grown up knowing the truth about the zone, has prepared deliberately rather than being thrust into crisis transformation, has the framework and vocabulary to understand what's happening to her when the full call comes. 2 days ago, I felt the approaching edge of my own transcendence, the moment when my consciousness would fragment beyond recovery into singular coherence, when I would exist only as distributed awareness across all timelines. When Marcus Thibodeaux, the individual, would dissolve into Marcus Thibodeaux, the eternal guardian pattern. I spent that day deliberately, consciously, appreciating every moment of linear existence while I still could. I had breakfast with Sarah, really tasted the coffee and toast, really listened to her talk about her nursing shift, really experienced the mundane domesticity that I would soon perceive only as abstract pattern rather than immediate reality. I watched Amelie practice basketball, felt pride in her developing skills, memorized the specific way she moved and smiled, storing these concrete details against the approaching abstraction of distributed consciousness. I drove my patrol route one last time as singular Marcus, one last experience of existing in one body, one time, one place, before fragmenting across infinite states. At 03:33 hours, I stood at mile marker 117 and felt the transformation completing, felt my consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries I'd been maintaining, felt the individual self dissolving into collective guardian pattern. I experienced my birth and death simultaneously, experienced every moment of my life overlapping, experienced myself across all possible timelines in superposition. I felt my connection to Sarah and Amelie stretching, thinning, becoming less immediate and more eternal. Love transforming from concrete experience to abstract pattern. I felt my physical body becoming optional, a habitual manifestation rather than necessary anchor, my identity becoming distributed rather than concentrated. I felt myself joining my uncle, joining Claire, joining all the Thibodeaux guardians across generations, our consciousnesses merging into collective awareness that existed across all times, all states, all possibilities simultaneously. But I held on to one final thread of singular existence, one maintained anchor point in the 2022 timeline. Because Amelie wasn't quite ready, because Michelle still needed preparation, because the transition required more time than my transcendence timing allowed. I exist now in what Dr. Chen calls threshold state, partially transcended, but maintaining enough linear coherence to still communicate, to still guide, to still serve as teacher and father and husband for a while longer. This state is unstable, can't be maintained indefinitely, will eventually collapse fully into transcendence, whether I'm ready or not. But it gives me weeks or possibly months to complete the transition planning, to ensure the zone has guardians ready to maintain it, to say proper goodbyes to people I love before I become something beyond their ability to perceive directly. Last month, 3 more people disappeared in the zone. This has become my focus now, the continuing disappearances, the travelers who stumble into temporal distortions without preparation, without guidance, without understanding. Some of them accept transformation quickly, becoming part of the guardian network or achieving peaceful integration into eternal states. But others resist, suffer, become trapped in loops like Jennifer Arsenault, adding to the weight of pain that the zone contains. Every disappearance reminds me why this duty matters, why guardians sacrifice normal existence to maintain boundaries, why the work continues despite its costs. People deserve protection from what they can't understand. Travelers deserve safe passage through thresholds they don't know exist. Reality deserves guardians who will hold boundaries even as those boundaries dissolve the guardians themselves into something beyond individual existence. Last month, 3 more people entered the zone during a convergence point. I guided 2 of them to acceptance. One resisted, broke under the weight of existing in multiple states, and now exists trapped in the moment of her terror for eternity, or until another guardian with more skill than I possess can ease her into integration. A new trooper, fresh from the academy, got assigned to my sector. I see the sensitivity in her, the genetic markers that indicate she might be called to the threshold. I've started the subtle process of preparation, dropping hints, sharing stories, watching for the moment when she begins to perceive the overlapping realities. Eventually, she might replace me, or she might join me as another guardian, expanding the network of protectors maintaining the boundary. The Department of Homeland Security knows what I am now. They have protocols for guardians, classified procedures for monitoring us, for ensuring we maintain the threshold without drawing public attention. I've signed the same NDAs my uncle signed, agreed to the same terms of silence. But silence has limits. Silence has costs. After watching more people disappear, after seeing more innocent travelers stumble into zones of temporal chaos because they had no warning,
Because they trusted that a highway is just a highway, and reality is solid, and time only flows in one direction, I decided the public deserves the truth, or as much truth as I can tell, without completely shattering their understanding of how reality works. If you drive Interstate 10 through the Atchafalaya Basin between mile markers 115 and 121, pay attention. If your GPS starts showing impossible coordinates, if your radio picks up voices from other eras, if you see other vehicles that flicker between existence and non-existence, if the temperature drops despite your thermometer reading normal, if you feel like you're moving through something thick and resistant despite the clear roadway ahead, you're experiencing the zone. You're crossing a threshold between times, between realities, between the solid world and the eternal web where all moments exist simultaneously. Most people pass through without incident. The guardians maintain the boundary, keep the overlapping realities separated enough that ordinary consciousness doesn't perceive them. But if you're sensitive, if you have the genetic markers, if you're descended from the people who have always known this place was sacred, you might perceive more. You might see the wooden bridges underlying the concrete. You might hear the voices of everyone who has ever traveled this route. You might feel the pull of the zone calling you to transformation. If that happens, if you feel the call, remember that transformation is not death. Expansion is not loss. Existing in multiple states simultaneously is not madness, but evolution. The guardians will guide you. We stand at the threshold always, maintaining the boundary, easing transitions, protecting both worlds, the temporal and the eternal. We exist in more states than ordinary consciousness can comprehend, but we remember our duty, remember our purpose, remember that someone must stand between worlds to keep reality from collapsing into temporal chaos. I am Trooper Marcus Thibodeaux. I patrol Interstate 10. I maintain the threshold. I exist in 2022 and 1952 and 1847, and in moments yet to come. I am guardian. I am bridge. I am the mark of sacrifice that keeps the boundary stable. I am what I chose to become when I accepted that duty matters more than comfort, that service extends beyond the visible world, that protection sometimes requires transformation into something beyond human understanding. Time isn't a line. Time is a web, all moments touching, all possibilities existing simultaneously. The Atchafalaya remembers everything. The zone remains. The guardians stand watch. And if you see a Louisiana State Trooper parked at mile marker 117 at 3:33 in the morning,
If you notice that their patrol car seems to flicker between existence and non-existence, if you see that their eyes reflect light in ways that show glimpses of other realities, you're seeing a guardian maintaining the threshold. Wave if you like. We appreciate the acknowledgement, but keep driving. Don't stop unless the zone calls you. And if it does call you, know that we'll be there to guide you through the transformation, to ease you into acceptance, to help you understand that what you thought was ending is actually beginning, that what you feared was loss is actually expansion, that becoming a guardian means sacrificing linear existence for eternal purpose. Welcome to Louisiana. Welcome to the Atchafalaya. Welcome to the place where time forgets itself and guardians remember everything. Drive safe. Pay attention. Respect the boundary. And if you feel the call, if you experience the pull, if you begin to perceive the overlapping realities, know that you're not going mad. You're becoming aware. You're approaching the threshold. And we guardians will be waiting to welcome you home, to guide you through, to help you understand that some duties transcend a single lifetime, that some responsibilities require existing across all timelines simultaneously, that protecting reality means sometimes stepping outside of it, that service never ends, but only transforms into something eternal. This is the Atchafalaya case. This is my testimony. This is the truth that the government would prefer stayed classified, but that the people deserve to know. The zone remains. The guardians maintain the boundary. And Interstate 10 continues to run through the heart of a dimensional threshold that has existed for 10,000 years and will exist for 10,000 more, held stable only by the sacrifice of those who accept the transformation and the duty. Time isn't a line. The missing are never really missing. Transformation is not death, and some boundaries are better left respected. But if you must cross them, guardians stand ready to ease your passage, to guide your transformation, to welcome you into the eternal purpose of maintaining the threshold between what was, what is, and what could be. Welcome to the Atchafalaya. The deep water remembers, and we guardians never forget.